Welcome to this second session of the AI Days on AI in humanitarian funding, ensuring fairness and transparency. And to discuss this, we have this great panel. We have Branka, which you all have gotten to know now. We have Håvard Nygård, who's the Director of Department of Knowledge and Innovation at NORAD, and also a former PRIO colleague. We have Paola Vesco, who's a senior researcher here at PRIO and work on the VIEWS project. And then we have David Hammond, who's the Director of Research at Institute of Economics and Peace. So this panel will look at how AI can be used in humanitarian funding, but we'll focus especially on how we can design systems ethically, transparency, and still be efficient. So my name is Siri Åsrystad. I'm a research director here at PRIO, and I'll moderate and lead this discussion. So the panelists will get 5 minutes first to reflect on a couple of questions. I will give you in a second. Since we're running a little bit short on time, I thought that when they're done with their reflections, I'll open the floor for questions if you have any. So think about what you would like to ask while they're talking. Okay, so the questions that we have asked our panelists to reflect on is, as AI becomes more integrated into humanitarian decision-making and operations, what do you see as the most important factor in ensuring AI driver decisions are both effective and ethically aligned with humanitarian principles? And also, how can we balance the need for optimization with the need for fairness, transparency, and accountability? And you are, of course, allowed to reflect on whichever part of these questions you would like. So, David, maybe we can start with you and then move towards me.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here for this AI Days over the next few days. So the part that I was going to sort of comment on was really around the ethics of this. And so as my position as Director of Research at the Institute for Economics and Peace, I oversee the sort of production of the Global Peace Index, which has already been mentioned by Branka this morning. And so over the past couple of years, we've obviously been, as everyone else has, been looking at how we can use AI to further research into peace and conflict. And I think the story I'm going to tell can best be summarized by a sort of paraphrased quote from Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, which is, it's easy to focus on whether we could, but it's harder to focus on whether we should. And certainly from IEP's point of view, we have a bit of an example of that. So, the Global Peace Index is a ranking of 163 countries on their levels of violence or fear of violence. And it's made up of 3 domains. There's a measure of safety and security, there's a measure of ongoing conflict, and there's a measure of militarization. And so militarization was an area that we've been sort of looking at improving our understanding of how to measure and track that over time. Because, currently, the main measures for militarization focus on military spending, and they focus on sort of the number of assets and so on and so forth. But obviously we've seen over the past decade, certainly, that technology is kind of playing a big role in the types of ways militaries are deployed and the nature of conflict that involve militaries. So the question we posed was, how could you measure and track the sort of technological capability of militaries over time? Knowing that a 5th generation aircraft is, depending on who you talk to, exponentially more capable than a 1st generation fighter jet. 30-year-old technology versus technology today it's apples and oranges. So, in order to do that, it was always going to be a sort of prior to ChatGPT coming along, it was going to be a very manual process of going through all the assets and sort of having this sort of ranking of assets and having a relative measure. As soon as ChatGPT came along, we thought, well, as we're learning how to use this technology, that's something we've been thinking about for a while. So let's trial it on that particular problem, and we did it. We have a measure of sort of technological military capability per country over the past 10 years. We had a sort of peer review with sort of military experts in our network. They couldn't really fault the methodology, and overall were sort of the results they were pretty confident with. The red flag came along when our comms and marketing team got very excited by this, because the actual rankings of the sort of relative military technology allowed for statements such as, and I'm not going to use particular countries, but think of two rival countries in the world. It allowed statements such as, Country A is 3 times more capable in its military than Country B. So as a peace research organization, while we were excited by the research, we weren't really sure that we should be putting that type of comparison out in the current context or in any context, really, because there is an ethical dilemma there. You don't want to invoke belligerence because of a statement like that, nor do you want to invoke a sort of arms race because of a statement like that. And obviously, we're a small organisation and a small cog in a big wheel, but there are ethical considerations around that. So, my sort of contribution to the question is really about, there's some really exciting things that can be done, but that sort of ethical consideration up front is pretty critical, I think, especially in these, early exciting days where everyone's just jumping in. So that would be my contribution.
Thank you, Paola.
Thanks, and thank you for moderating the session. Thanks, Branka, for an excellent introduction and keynote speech. It was really exciting. So I think I would like to highlight 3 points that come from my expertise and the work with the VIEWS project. For those of you who do not know the acronym, VIEWS stand for Violence and Impact Early Warning System. And it's a project at PRIO and Uppsala University where we use open source data to predict the risk, but also the number of fatalities related to armed conflict. And so I'm going to focus on conflict forecasting here because that's my experience and expertise. And I think there are the point that I want to highlight are sort of recent and exciting progress, but also room for improvement and further avenues for research. So the first is concerning more the methodological side of conflict forecasting. And I think by working with policymakers and stakeholders, we realized that it's very important to transition towards uncertainty forecasts and probabilistic forecasts that can give us and give stakeholders and users more of a measure of caution when reading and interpreting and using this forecast. So for those of you who are not really familiar with conflict forecasting, most of the existing systems in the past and up to now have been forecasting either the binary conflict occurrence or the risk of conflict occurring, or point estimates of the number of fatalities associated with conflicts. And although this has been really encouraging and a lot of progress has been made in the recent years, we think it's still a lot more work has to be made in transitioning towards forecasting with uncertainty. And the reason for this is point estimates risk to miss the most interesting developments for the users and the decision makers. We know that conflict, thankfully, is a rare phenomenon. And so point estimates risk to always cluster around 0. And probabilistic forecasts are much more useful to policymakers and stakeholders because they can alert to risks of conflict escalation or tensions escalating to very catastrophic humanitarian disasters or crises. So that's, I think, something that we in Views have been working on. A prediction challenge has been organized recently to boost improvements on these developments. So this is something that is happening, but at the same time, we need more work on. The second point I would like to highlight is we need a continuous engagement with users and stakeholders. And I think most of us from the research community are used and trained to share our results at the very end of the process, only through publications, policy reports, conference presentations, and so on. And although this is necessary and fundamental, I think one experience we had and one learning process we had in our project, we need a continuous engagement with the policymakers, the practitioners, the users community. And I give you a few examples of what I mean with this. I was recently talking to a UN agency, and the biggest question they had when approaching Views was, we need you to tell us when and how to integrate your system in our decision-making process. And the question comes from a place where these organizations are very interested in incorporating these tools, but they do not really know how. And it comes from a place where there is a very predefined planning, also regarding timelines. So funding is given out at a multi-annual pace, and they don't really know how to integrate this thinking or forecasting of impending crisis. They do not know how to considering this like looming or more fast-paced developments in their decision-making processes. So that's one example of where we, the research community, the peace tech practitioners, and the IGOs, government agencies, and so forth, need to sit together and think, how do we make this happen? And finally, I think one key point that we have been thinking about, and that's one of the main goals that Views has been working on, is to shift from a place where we, as a community, are largely focusing on predicting conflict to a place where we help decision makers and users to predict. We provide predictions of conflict impacts. So we have experienced that we've worked a lot with decision makers, some international organizations that take our forecasts of conflict and use them as input to, for example, predict famine or healthcare access or water access and so forth. I'm just giving a few examples here. And although this is very much aligned with our, mission of being transparent and making our forecast usable, we think that the moment is the time is ready, and we have the data and the methods that enable us to produce forecasts that are much more targeted to the needs of the users. And so instead of producing only conflict forecasts, we can help with the right, investment in research and the right empirical, scientifically based innovations. We could help decision makers by providing forecasts of the impacts of conflict. And we know that conflict impacts many dimensions of societies, from access to water, healthcare, food, and so forth. But we think that we need more investment in making this shift. And this will help achieve a much more robust forecast, but also much more transparent and fair system. Thank you.
Thank you, Paola. And now Håvard, who's representing the people you want to talk to.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Always good to be back at PRIO to discuss these important topics. So I think I agree with everything that has been said, but I still want to, I think I want to tackle a very good question from a slightly different angle. And that is, okay, so now let's talk about how to integrate AI in an ethical manner. From where I'm sitting, right, I see very little use of AI. When it comes, there's a lot of pilots, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of nice little projects everywhere. But when it comes to decision-making on humanitarian funding from Norway, there's no AI in the loop at any point in the decision-making process for a single krone of Norwegian humanitarian assistance. I think that goes for most funders. Doesn't mean a lot of funders doesn't have a nice little AI project or, they're supporting this or they're supporting that. But when it comes to actually using it in decision-making, very little is happening. So from my perspective, right, the primary question is still, how do we ensure that we can actually use AI in an efficient manner, or start using it in humanitarian decision-making, especially when it comes to funding? And I think that's a core question, right? So we all know that humanitarian needs far outstrip available funding. The most recent humanitarian appeals raise, maybe as little as a third of available of necessary funding. So from my perspective, there's two core problems or issues at the heart of the current humanitarian system. The one is needs and targeting. The other is cost effectiveness. Right? How do we map the needs? How do we ensure that we target humanitarian funding in an as efficient way as possible? That's an information problem. Right? At heart, that's an information problem. That's where it's easy to see the utility of AI, where it's easy to see the utility of something like views, where it's also quite easy to see how you can do that in a manner that doesn't at all come into conflict or friction at all with humanitarian principles, or doesn't really raise any of these big ethical questions. It's basically a question of making human decision-making more effective, more efficient. So needs is one part of it. The other part is cost effectiveness. Right? The variation in cost effectiveness in humanitarian interventions is extreme. Right? Basically, in all of aid, the development assistance isn't normally distributed. Right? It's not like most stuff work roughly as has a comparable level of effectiveness. Some stuff is extremely cost effective, and some stuff has very low cost effectiveness. So we could do much more if we invested much more in the most effective tools at our disposal, and ensure that those tools found the people most in need. But that's the cost effectiveness question, right? Is also at heart a information question. It's about getting the data, getting a hold of the research, getting an overview, etc., etc., etc. All of the stuff that at different level of an organization is what people do, and where decisions at different levels are made, and where AI can be useful and isn't really used at all today. To give an example, so Plan Norway, the development organization that runs children's villages and stuff. It's not really a big partner. It's what would you say, a medium-sized actor in the Norwegian development landscape. They did a nice little exercise where they looked at how much time they spent writing results reportings or writing up reports to NORAD. So Plan is a medium-sized, medium-small partner for NORAD, and NORAD is just one of many partners that Plan has. Plan spent around 1,200 hours writing reports to Norway. Obviously, beautiful reports, extremely informative reports, reports that we, were very happy to receive. But I think it's fairly easy to make the case that some of those 1,200 hours could be used in a more efficient way and could be used in a way that actually benefited people in need much more. So Plan actually did a little experiment. They tried using AI to automatically generate reports. That worked beautifully. AI basically writes reports just as well as a human, right? Because there's very little creativity involved in this. You just need to summarize it, and you need to be concise and everything. Meaning that if an organization like Plan would be allowed to use AI for those kinds of tasks, you're freeing up a lot of resources. And in NORAD, across the entire aid system, by far the scarcest resource is human man and women power, right? Hours. If you could free up a little bit of those hours, the impact of that can be absolutely extreme. And that's where I think there's an obvious case for using AI, and there's also an obvious case for how we can use AI without, to repeat myself, getting into conflict with any humanitarian principles, or really getting into waters that are very ethically murky at all. Maybe naively, but that's how it looks from my perspective.
Thank you. Branka, finally?
Oh my gosh, how many hours I could have saved of my life not writing reports. But I do agree, there are so many others. I think those are also 3 different examples, right, of different types of utilization of AI. And maybe I'm bringing a different story, and it's interesting now to compare to your comments that there are no use cases of AI in humanitarian funding. I'm bringing this story, which is quite old now, from 2016. I was at that time. So my work is mostly at the nexus of development, humanitarian, and peace building. And at that time, I was at the World Bank. There is a unit called Fragility, Conflict, and Violence at the World Bank that was at that time piloting a project called Famine Early Action Mechanism. Collaboration with different agencies, with OCHA, with United Nations, with Red Cross as well, and with some private sector. At 2016, although the World Bank is quite strong on statistic, AI was a new thing as well. So they brought on board companies like Microsoft, Amazon, Google to help with the data science and to see how data science can be used to predict the probability of famine happening in conflict areas. And I was brought to the team as a short-term consultant at that time, who was working on famines, trying to bring that knowledge of what actually modern famines are. Because famines are, we let's say, eradicated. I don't know if famine can be, it's not a disease, but we eradicated the famines at the end of the 20th century. And now suddenly in 21st century, we are again tackling with this additional burden to the humanitarian sector that we don't need to have. And there was this idea of actually using the machine learning to try to get earlier red flags, right? To have earlier warnings similar to conflicts. Can we actually get that earlier signal so that we can motivate the entire humanitarian sector, including the funding, to actually react earlier and consequently save lives? And why I'm mentioning this, because this was 2016, right? And at that time, not many ethical conversations in AI were happening. That was a very early stage of even discussing the AI ethics as such. And the questions that we were struggling with were more structural questions like misuse of the tool. Like what happens if actually malicious actor gets the same tool, predicts the probability of famine happening in a certain area, and then intentionally targets that area? Or questions like what happens if countries themselves start pushing their populations into hunger, extreme hunger, just to get that threshold, reaching that threshold to actually release the funding? But when you look into these questions, the questions were not actually around data science, right? So why I'm saying this, because I think we went a long path since 2016, developing, understanding what are all of the additional challenges in utilizing this technology in humanitarian, not only funding, this session is framed around funding, but in general, we can talk about any utilization, right, of the data science. What are all of these ethical layers, the questions? We don't even talk today, I mean, some in the area, experts in area try to even avoid the ethical conversations and talk more about these trustworthy technologies, right? How can we build them in such a way to actually ensure that they are not harming the populations that we are trying to help, or that they actually do what they are intended to do? And now we slipped into, and I'm really curious from the examples of your organizations, when we started doing the research at AI for Peace, we have a project around AI ethics and how we can build a specific tool for peace builders to actually help them once they start even thinking about building the tool, first answering the question, should we at all, right? Is that really necessary? And then if it's really necessary, like in this case, I don't think for humanitarian applications it's unnecessary. Obviously, we have so many issues and problems, and we need additional help to be able to react quicker and more efficiently. But how we actually do that to ensure that we are following all of the ethical standards and principles. And now we slipped into another challenge that when we started interviewing practitioners in the field, we realized that there are more than 600 available ethical standards and principles out there. So that's beyond the humanitarian sector. In humanitarian, there are maybe 3 organizations that are setting the scene, right? OCHA or Red Cross, or especially with data responsibility. Data responsibility is the field that has been acknowledged much earlier. Not that many emphasis exist for models themselves, for example, or for broader algorithm development. So how data scientists decide out of 600 available guidance out there, which one is actually relevant for them, they will listen to their organization for sure, but the organizations are struggling with this of understanding what is the relevant principle that they want to adopt. So they started working internally in committing to certain principles. And then they hit another problem. And then, Paola, maybe you can share your experience as well as a data scientist. How do you then transfer all of these ethical principles that you understand now? You are committing to transparency, to explainability, to privacy. What does that mean when you actually start building the tool, right? It's not that easily transferable to the data scientist to understand how to do that switch from principles to practice. And this is where I think we still need more guidance and more work to be done to actually feel comfortable with a certain tool without necessarily, we notice from our own work that the data scientists are introducing the tools from private companies. Are they actually applicable or enough for the work in fragile contexts like the one that we are working on? So those are some of the insights from my field, and then maybe I would have just a quick follow-up question to your work, especially, for example, between your 2 organizations, because more and more often we see that users would trust the provider in building a certain tool. Is that actually enough, right? Is there certain ethical standard that you should still be applying, being an organization in the field or providing that funding? And it should not be enough to say Views is doing this or PRIO is doing that. So this is an additional question that popped up in interviews and conversations we had with organizations we are working with.
Great. I think we'll just jump to Håvard and then maybe Paola, and you can respond to Branka.
Excellent. So I'll answer that, but I have to just tag on to one point that Branka had first on the fragility, conflict, violence work that the World Bank does, which is excellent. But I think the following example or the following thing illustrates a little bit where the where the pressure points are at the moment, right? So we have the World Bank, through the Fragility Conflict Violence Program, now has dedicated funding for prevention. The World Bank actually has money to prevent armed conflict. That's fantastic. You know, preventing armed conflict is orders of magnitude more cost-effective than responding humanitarian after the fact. Prevention is, at heart, a prediction question, right? So you'd like the World Bank to have, you know, access to data science, have access to views, and be able to use that kind of technology to anticipate armed conflict and to use the prevention funding that they have. Are they doing that? No. To get prevention funding from the World Bank today, you have to cross a threshold of battle debts, right? So you're not allowed to prevent armed conflict until you've had a minimum number of armed conflict, minimum level of armed conflict, right? It would be like saying that you're not allowed to start eating more healthy to prevent a heart attack until you've had a little bit of a heart attack first, right? Obviously, that's not the World Bank's fault at all. The World Bank has really good data science teams. They understand this. They would like to work differently, but it's a political question. It's a question of what funders are willing to let the World Bank do, and it's also a question of what kind of risk we allow our organizations to do. And I think, you know, to try to ease into your really good question, Branka, I think there's something about, you know, that if you are going to use AI or data science more broadly effectively in decision making, you do need decision makers at various levels of the organization to actually understand it to some level, right? Obviously, not everyone can be a data scientist, but you need some baseline level of understanding of what it is, what I can do. And that's also, you know, that's always so that quickly becomes an interesting discussion of what do you do in-house and what do you bring in from the outside. And I think right now, in general, right, the level of expertise in, you know, data science, AI, in senior management positions throughout the humanitarian system is, let's say, limited diplomatically, and that's a bottleneck right now for adoption of technology.
Paola, do you want to respond to Branka?
Yeah, quickly, maybe from the other side of the wall or bridge. Very interesting question. I really agree 100% with what you both said. But short answer is I do not think anyone should just give us trust unconditionally. And I think this is truly against any scientific principle other than humanitarian principle. So my perspective on this, it would be compare and back any decision on scientific publications first, because not because scientific publications are an indication of ethical standards necessarily, but because they would give you an insurance of at least scientific standards and transparency and a carefully vetted product that has gone through peer review. And I'm not sure if there are any equivalent, like as of now, carefully vetting processes as peer review now, with all the caveats that we all are aware of. So that's where I would start, and I think we this would ensure at least that users can understand what they are going to use. But of course, this also needs a certain level of data literacy, right? And also it requires us to do a better job in probably communicating the results of our peer-reviewed papers, which maybe policymakers, users, stakeholders do not have the capacity or time to read, right? So I think it goes a little bit both ways. Maybe policymakers and stakeholders do not need to trust one provider, but I'm hoping they can trust the scientific community and the peer review and scientific community or scientific processes. And second, we as a research community can do better in communicating the results of this process to non-academic audiences.
Thank you. Let's open up for questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and then, yep, Simon. There's a mic coming from behind.
Nice. Thank you all so much. This is extremely exciting. So, so if I had a car with a dashboard and my mechanic for some reason told me you can only have 3 things on your dashboard, I would be like, that's a bit cheap of you, but fair enough. But I would probably choose, to see how fast is my car going, probably want to see how much gas is left, and maybe whether or not it needs an oil change, right? Those would be pretty important things that I needed to know. And with that, I could probably get by with the way that I use a car. So to all of you, if you were to have, to imagine a kind of a early warning system, and it could be for conflict or the impact of conflict, and you're like, but I need to understand 3 things about this system to be able to, for instance, recommend it to the World Bank or to NORAD and saying, this system is because we know these 3 things about it, or these 3 metrics, we think we can use it for something. And it doesn't need to be technical. It can be super abstract. So do you have any ideas of what 3 things you would really like to know about an early warning system before you could recommend it? Thanks.
Thank you. Do you want to all respond to that? We want to start with you, David?
Sure. I mean, it's a great analogy. And, having not thought of it before, which is annoying because it's such a great analogy, I think the answer to it would be what's the equivalence for those particular things? I mean, oil and petrol sort of gives you an indication of where you are today, and velocity gives you an indication of where you're going. Some combination of that, the equivalent, is pretty much the aim of every early warning system. But again, I guess the challenge with that, and this is something that we deal with, I'm sure everyone's dealt with this, is how do you legitimately compress the complexity of, in this field, conflict prediction into something like that and have confidence that that's actionable. So that would be my take on it.
Paola?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I think I would look at first the data, so what goes into the system and how it's defined. Is it open access data? Is it transparent? Can I find more about the data if I want to? And second, I would like to know, how is the system validated? Is it validated? How is it validated? Is it tested against data? What are the possible implications of this validation system? And I think it's especially important that this kind of system does any out-of-sample validation, or imagining what would the result or the predictions be today, for today, if I, or in 2022, if I knew or had access to information in 2020. So I think these are the basic fundamentals that I would try to ask or get information on, and then I think it's important to understand, or I would ask myself, what is the level of human input, and where does it start and where does it stop? And this can go in. You can have human inputs at different stages of the process, and I think much of it is needed. And there's a lot of discussion on where should we stop, and what human input is needed to ensure fairness and transparency. But I think then we also need to understand: is the human input needed? And do we need to limit it somewhere, for example, to avoid biases? one very practical example of this is once I receive the results and I know that my system is carefully vetted, is transparent, has been trained and tested, and I've been carefully addressing any potential biases of this system, do I stop there? My interpretation of this in terms of human input would be yes, I need to stop here. Because if I go back and revise the results of my system, then I think the human input is adding rather than addressing any biases. Does it make any sense?
Okay, Håvard, what would you have on your dashboard?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic question. So let me try to simplify it a little bit. So, right, so from NORAD's perspective or from Norway's perspective, right, we are basically our job is to spend money, right? Spend money to fulfill whatever humanitarian need. At the heart of all humanitarian funding is, or should be at least, a humanitarian needs assessment. That's the basis for your funding allocation. Let's keep it that simple, right? I have some money, I want to spend that money. How do I spend that money? And then I think I would simply want 3 things on my dashboard. Incidentally, I think you provide all of those 3 things already. So let's keep it to conflict, right? Where is the conflict going to happen? What's the impact, the predicted impact of the conflict going to be? How certain are you? From a purely, how am I going to best spend my money? Sitting, in January and I have a budget that I have to spend this year. Then I have a bunch of ongoing conflicts and I have a bunch of pretty likely conflicts. That would be a very useful thing to have in a dashboard. The tricky thing, I guess, is that I know that I can get that in a dashboard right now. It's not really used in a decision-making dashboard.
So Branka, you got the longest time to think about this.
Yeah, and what to add? But that's a great question.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, you lost me with the car immediately. It's like when you mention a sports metaphor, you lose me immediately. I'm kidding. I think it's a great metaphor because it can actually be seen in many other layers as well, and I love it because we also use it to explain to decision makers that they don't need to know what is in the car, right? How the entire mechanics of the car functions to actually be able to drive the car. But do you actually trust the company that was building the car to be able to sit in the car? So not necessarily what are the 3 things that you're seeing, because I also need to trust that the speed that I'm seeing on the dashboard is the real one. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's what I meant when I posed the question, do you actually trust the provider of the algorithm data set or whichever product? And I think this will be a crucial, much more important question for the entire development of AI in humanitarian field or any other field. Now, I think we are seeing the question in 2 different ways because I'm seeing it from the perspective of a user and you're seeing it from the perspective of somebody who builds the tool, right? And from that perspective, I would probably maybe go beyond of how certain you are that the predictions are right, like looking in historically, how many times the car actually the dashboard show correctly the speed. I would like to know that because how do I trust then if it made a mistake so many times before? And if you translate that to prediction of conflict, I think I would rather want to have false positives and still invest, right? Like even if conflict doesn't happen, I would still be investing in certain area to prevent the conflict, rather than the other way around, right? I would not like to miss that something happens and then basically put people in a position to die or suffer. But I'm not a donor, and donors would like that, right? They would like the most precision out there to actually know if with the biggest certainty a conflict will happen or not. Yeah, so I think that's what I would like to see.
Thank you. More questions? Yes. Here.
Hi, I'm Kati Yunkishi, Head of Data Science with ACLID. This is a question maybe for Håvard, but if anyone else wants to chime in as well. I'm curious because you've mentioned how, we have a lot of these tools, but no one's using them. And I'm curious, you know, as someone who's trying to make the tools that people are hopefully using, is the issue more about that, sort of as the tool makers, we don't have a deep understanding of how decisions are being made, and therefore how what we create can slot in nicely and be useful? Or is it more of a structural institutional issue that it's just not the first thing people reach for? They've been doing this for many decades without using a dashboard, and it's hard to get them to pivot to that.
Yeah, I guess the boring answer to that question, right, is that it's definitely a little bit of both, right? That's true for any large organization, right? There's a lot of inertia, there's a lot of business as usual. It's how we've done stuff always. To really fundamentally change how a system works is hard. Something that takes a long time and takes a lot of commitment. And it takes commitment from the top, right? You need to have senior leadership. You need a commander who really is willing to push an organization in that direction. That's obviously one issue. Another issue that I've talked about already is, you know, the level of understanding is still probably lacking, right? It's quantitative data science skills is not usually what people that go into humanitarian development settings have invested the most training in. They had different interests. They were doing other stuff. But I think we're at the point now where, you know, a rudimentary or maybe even rudimentary plus understanding of data science is something everyone needs, even if you're, you know, a humanitarian aid worker in South Sudan. It's useful. It's necessary. But then I think it's also, you know, decision makers are risk averse. Most decision makers are risk averse. I think especially most politicians, right, who ultimately control how we distribute humanitarian funding are you know, risk averse. And I think it's easier probably to. No one is going to fault you for responding in a big way to the Gaza crisis when it's clear to everyone that the Gaza crisis is huge, going to need much more money than anyone has. But you might very well be faulted for investing in something that didn't really end up becoming a big thing, or in something that seemed to have a less effect. So, you know, all of these things need to come together, right? And you need to find the organizations where stars are aligned. You actually have leadership that's committed to it. You have a level of understanding within the organization, or a willingness within the organization to learn and adopt the tools, and you need the risk appetite to actually try.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can just provide a sort of outsider's perspective as working for an organization that, similar to ACLED, builds these tools for the major multilaterals. I would agree with that assessment, just from my perspective. But what that manifests in a project when you're building something like this tool is there is an initial inertia, which is why an organization might engage an organization like IEP or ACLED. And so the hope is that external organization can come in and overcome that inertia. But what happens pretty regularly is, in order to overcome that inertia, consensus is sought internally. So you have a lot of stakeholders engaged that have to agree on, you know, what this dashboard is going to look like. And so the project itself starts quite bounded, and then this consensus approach means that, you know, everyone's interests, if it, you know, you'll have people who say, well, if it doesn't do this, it's no good to me. So then you try to incorporate that, and you have 20 of those different types of views. So by the end of it, you end up all dashboard, and, you know, it's a little kid's bicycle at the back. So it sort of, and that then feeds a bit of a cycle, because you have this initial inertia and reticence and, you know, sort of kind of disbelief this is useful. You go through this process, and by the end of it, it's, you know, self-fulfilled prophecy proved right. So, you know, I've certainly been involved in some of those. We sort of try and now curtail that early by telling those stories, to try and work with the partner to you know, make sure that we don't end up there. But it is a risk for these types of things.
Can I just quickly, I just 2 words, I think, and we worked a lot in the previous 2 years with different ministries trying to understand and to have the answer to the same question. I think trust, and maybe we can do a quick poll in the room. Like, would you trust more a human making a decision or a machine making a decision? So human, let's see the hands up. And the machine? So look, like 3 hands maybe for a machine. It's like, for some reason, we tend to put machines on a higher standard of trust than humans. And this is what we realized, at least in the ministries of foreign affairs that we worked with, that somehow human forecasters are still trusted more. And maybe that's related to accountability as well, because it's much easier than to say, oh, who is responsible for making a decision for this? It's this and this person. When you use a system, it's, especially when it depends which system we are using, but if there are black boxes, if you don't know what is happening behind the system, how do you actually ensure that accountability, right? And I think we are achieving much more now with explainability, and I think ACLED is doing the same, right? Trying to actually explain how the decisions, or which specific element of a forecast contributed to a certain prediction, right? Which, from conversations that we had with our clients, helps a lot. So having at least this explanation of how the algorithm actually came to a certain decision helps people have more trust in actually using the tool. But that's in terms of using ACLED, for example, or using something that has already been created by somebody externally. Completely other story is building something internally. And that's maybe for another conversation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll have to wrap up there. It's noon, so it will be lunch. But I think one of the takeaways from this panel is that we need much more information and knowledge about AI and trust in it for it to be as efficient as it can be. So thank you to the panelists. You have all contributed a lot, and I think it was a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.